Morning we're going to begin in Leviticus chapter 13, and this chapter is going to consist of really detail on how to identify leprosy and various other types of infirmities or diseases. And as this unfolds, we'll see how this is going to shake out, but it's quite detailed. There's various symptoms to identify by in this chapter, as well as in chapter 14 and in chapter 15. So as we look at it, we need to keep in mind that this not only is talking about the hard case of leprosy, but when you look at it, sometimes this word leper is also used in the Hebrew to mean other conditions. And so I thought what we do to begin with, we'll kind of look at that, and we'll look and see what some of this actually means and what's going on with it. So this morning, we're in Leviticus chapter 13. Conversation of it overall has to do with the law and tokens concerning leprosy. Now, I know when we think about leprosy, we isolate it to just that one condition with the white spots all over, and people's condition is degenerating. We associate it with Jesus touching the leper. So is that leprosy? It is. Today we call it something like Hansen's disease, and I'll get with it like that. But there are some conditions that in their early stages, as the priests are looking at these people and looking at their symptoms and condition, it may be deemed not leprosy. I know those of us that maybe have some psoriasis issues, or maybe we have relatives do, which I do have some psoriasis issues, okay? And when you look at the early stages of leprosy and you look at this psoriasis that I have, guess what it looks like? Leprosy, okay? But it's not. So this is what you're going to see in this chapter. So we need to take a look at how these things are used and their context of them. And I'm not going to get into detail of that, but we know the leprosy that in Jesus' day and the hard case of leprosy as we know it looks something like this. And like I say, if I have a larger of this, you could take a section of this, maybe a 1 inch by 1 inch or a 1 inch diameter of it, and pull it out and look at it, and it looks very similar to psoriasis, okay? So is it leprosy or psoriasis? Is it early stages of the measles? Because it's going to talk about reddish spots and greenish spots. Is it early stages of chicken pox? Or is it leprosy? So it was up to the priest to make a decision on how they were going to handle this and to treat the clean or uncleanliness. As a matter of fact, it's going to talk about in the skin, under the skin, hair turning white, not white, so on and so forth. So it's quite detailed. Laws about skin diseases, skin depth, ancient insights on cleanliness, disease, and restoration. Here we go. This chapter, rich in regulations and procedures, highlights the divine wisdom that governed health and social interaction within the ancient Israelite community. Despite the strict rules, there is a profound message of compassion, demonstrating that every effort should be made to restore those afflicted back to health and societal integration. And so we find that even though it's like this, the whole idea of it was to see if we can get these people healthy again and get them back into society. And isn't that kind of what we still do today in the medical thing with people? The idea is to try to cure them or get them to a state to where they can function again in society. So this is the thought and idea behind it, as well as, health and hygiene, okay? What about the meaning of this word leprosy? And I thought it was real interesting. I didn't put the Hebrew and all that up here. Eric, I'll have to leave that to somebody like Reed Brown or somebody like that studied this Greek and Hebrew, because I might make a bigger mess than what what it needs to be, okay? But anyway, the general overview of this word leprosy has to do with the Hebrew word does not exactly correspond to what we call leprosy today. It is with a very general term that perhaps includes ringworm, psoriasis, leukodermia, which is a softening of the skin, as well as Hansen's disease. That's what we call it today. The modern medical terminology used to refer to what is commonly called leprosy today. Okay? Illnesses such as smallpox, measles, scarlet fever might start out with a skin condition considered to be leprosy. That's why it gets so detailed about what did the spots look like. What is their deal? What's going on here with them? We think it may be leprosy, so we're going to quarantine you over here. You're going to find that if we don't think it's leprosy, you're going to be considered clean. And it goes back and forth, okay? That's how to do it. So basically what the priests were God's authorized Jewish doctors. That's what they were becoming, okay? You're going to see this in chapter 14 and chapter 15, okay? Because it even gets into the house about regulating and identifying, and it uses the term leprosy, though. Some translations, and we'll see this, actually state that if you find mildew or mold in the house. So there are certain funguses that were considered to be a type of leprosy. Maybe it's in its infancy, but it worked out not to be. And they even talk about how you had to tear the house down to get rid of the mold or the mildew, okay? So I thought it was real interesting. It's kind of like a lot of things. Sometimes we kind of isolate it to what we know today, but in the old world, it actually carries a little bit broader meaning, okay? Illnesses such as smallpox, measles, scarlet fever might start out with a skin condition considered to be leprosy, and the person will be isolated for the necessary time until the condition cleared up. So they will go monitor that person for a period of time. They would be isolated or separated from everybody else till they could, they didn't have modern things like we have today that where they could test the skin, they could test the infection, they could test the sore, and within a short period of time or a day or two, they can say, well, it's cancerous, or it's benign, or it's this, or it's that, or whatever. So, this quarantine helped prevent the spread of these kinds of diseases amongst the people of Israel. And we used to see this quite common in our society today. It's still so in some societies about when there are diseases and illnesses out there, people used to be quarantined. In other words, they were separated, they were taken out of society and put in a separate area, a separate building, or a separate facility until the doctors can get a handle on it, okay? And it's the same thought process with this. What about the meaning of this word leprosy? When leprosy first appears on victims' skin, it begins as a small red spot. Okay, you get a small red spot on your skin today, what is it? A lot of times you don't know if it's an insect bite, maybe it's a pimple, maybe it's whatever, a rash, maybe you were out cutting grass or you got into something. So just because a red spot appears on the skin does not make it leprosy, okay? This is what they're getting at in this. Before too long, though, they get bigger, start to turn white, having a shiny or scaly appearance. Soon the spots spread over the entire body, the hair begins to fall out, first from the head, then even from the eyebrows as these things get worse. So, it starts out, maybe has a small red dot, okay? Could be anything. Well, as they're quarantined and they begin to monitor it, it begins to turn white. Well, one of the things you're going to find in this chapter, just because it turns white, does that mean it's leprosy? No. If I was to roll this shirt up and you take a look at this elbow with this psoriasis on it, guess what it's going to look like? Leprosy. Okay? So, just because it's there does not necessarily mean that's what it is. You got to go through the diagnostic stage of the symptoms and conditions that you're seeing, okay? Just like a medical doctor does today. The fingernails and toenails become loose, they start to rot, and eventually fall off. Then the joints of the fingers and toes begin to rot and start to fall off piece by piece. In the mouth, the gums start shrinking and are unable to hold teeth, so several teeth are often lost. Leprosy keeps eating away at the face until the nose is literally gone, and the palate and even eyes rot, and the victims waste away until death. So it's a terrible disease when if that's what it is and it comes to fruition. Yeah, you can see it's bad, isn't it? It's really bad. One of the things that we're going to see is there's a likeness unto leprosy and sin that the Bible uses has an analogy, okay? So it is a terrible disease when it's at fruition. Got a question, Brother Doughboy, I got a question here. So what does this mean? Okay, let's just break all this out and put it in maybe a one-sentence statement, okay? Biblically, leprosy refers to several skin diseases and even some kinds of fungus. And we're going to see that when we get like over into chapter 14, over into chapter 15, and things like that. It's not just isolated to that. Such as those found in the walls of houses and in clothing. Remember we said they're going to tell them if it's deemed to be that mold, a fungus, or if the priest said that's a type of leprosy, then what would happen to the house? Daddy used to talk about it, and we've probably seen it in movies that years and years and years ago, in the old world, if a house was deemed diseased and maybe the person in it had running issues of blood, scarlet fever, all that kind of stuff, the beds were contaminated from sweat and body fluids and blood, things of that nature, and they were suspicious that it was throughout the house. What did they do? They burned it, didn't they? Yeah. Not unusual, is it, to actually just destroy the house? Well, we know today in our modern world, since post-World War II, we can control that better with chemicals and remediations and things of that nature. But they did not have that technology back then, see? So there had to be a way to control all of this. The leprosy that Christ healed was similar to what is today called Hansen's disease, a detestable infection that can greatly disfigure and destroy the human body. So if it was deemed leprosy, then you were totally isolated. There were laws regarding that you had to do. And not come in contact with people, but if there were people around in the area, you had to make the statement, unclean, 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 to keep people back away from you so you did not spread this terrible disease. Chapter 15, Daniel, is going to be interesting. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in it. Most of us that's worked in industry, probably right in the food service industry, we have to undergo what's called bloodborne pathogen, bloodborne body fluid training about body fluids and blood and things like that being present in the workplace. God did that a long time ago, Daniel. So you can tell them when the OSHA inspector comes in, hey, long before you guys got here, it's already in Leviticus chapter 15. All right. But anyway, we'll get into all that. So you're going to find there's a lot of regulations in all this, okay? But this true case of leprosy is like a true case of cancer, right? It can be bad. You know, just because, and here a while back I had an indication that maybe my cancer was coming back last year. So it took on the appearance or the symptom of it, so I had to go to the Montgomery Cancer Center and have a PET scan done. Well, it wasn't, okay? And it finally just went away. But you see how it can take on the appearance of it? So just because it appears doesn't necessarily mean that it is, okay? It has to be diagnosed and then it has to be treated, okay? Morgan, you've got verses 1 through 8 of this Leviticus chapter 13.
And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a man has on the skin of his body a swelling, a scab, or a bright spot, and it becomes on the skin of his body like a leprous sore, then he shall be brought to Aaron the priest, or to one of his sons the priest. The priest shall examine the sore on the skin of the body, and if the hair on the sore has turned white, and the sore appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a leprous sore. Then the priest shall examine him and pronounce him unclean. But if the bright spot is white on the skin of the body and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and its hair has not turned white, then the priest shall isolate the one who has the sore 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the seventh day. And indeed, if the sore appears to be as it was, and the sore has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall isolate him another 7 days. Then the priest shall examine him again on the seventh day. And indeed, if the sore is faded and the sore has not spread on the skin, then the priest shall proclaim him clean. It is only a scab, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean. But if the scab should at all spread over the skin, after he has been seen by the priest for his cleansing, he shall be seen by the priest again. And if the priest sees that the scab has indeed spread on the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is leprosy.
Okay, so can you see how the diagnosis takes place? Just because a spot appears, notice what it says in verse 2. When a man shall have the skin of his flesh a rising, a scab, a bright spot, and it be in the skin of the flesh like the plague of leprosy. So it's taken on some similarity of the symptom of leprosy. And here again, just because it takes on that symptom now, they're given instructions about how to isolate this person and look at it. You know, very often we go to the doctor and maybe something like that very similar happens to us, that it takes on the appearance of something, so maybe they do a blood test, and just for precaution, they might take us out of work for a few days. Or they might tell us to stay in for a few days until they see what it is, okay? Well, here again, they didn't have that technology, so they would look at it this week, give it more time to incubate, look at it this week, look at it more time to incubate. Well, who knows? It may just be a scab and they're pronounced clean. But if the progress continues with the symptom getting worse and worse, then what happens? At some point, they declare it has a leprosy or some type of disease, okay? The Lord gave Moses and Aaron instructions for the priests to diagnose skin diseases based on specific symptoms. And really, when we go to the doctor today, what do they really treat to start with? They may not know the cause of it, but they treat the what? The symptom, right? Okay. Then if they find out the root cause, they can attack that. You know, it's that way with a lot of diseases that we have even today. Any of you brother have any comments or questions on that? I know I kind of blow through it kind of quick, but I didn't want to get bogged down in trying to make us Jewish doctors, okay? Because I'd be a poor one for that, right?
Knowing the restrictions that the priests had on cleanliness, how were they able to be in such close contact with lepers during the diagnosis phase if they weren't infected themselves?
God gave them specific regulations in Leviticus chapter 16, I believe it is, so we'll be getting to that. So they had to become unclean. Let me find that title page to see if I can see it. How the high priest must enter into the holy place, chapter 16. So we'll be getting to that. So there are regulations on that here again, if they touch it or come in contact with it, they're considered unclean. So if you're considered unclean, what do you have to do? Well, you got to get clean. So God has taken all that into account. It's kind of like today. A doctor goes in and he does some work on you. Well, part of the protocol, depending upon your symptom or whatever you may have, is what's the first thing he's supposed to do? Dispose of his latex gloves or his gown or whatever he may have on and wash his hands, okay, before he goes anywhere else. So it's not uncommon, is it, to be exposed to these things, but then you got to be clean again, haven't you? And we're talking about, in the priest's case, they got to be clean spiritually, but what about any contamination on their clothes? That's got to be destroyed, okay? So, yeah, it's in there, okay? The progression and examination of skin diseases, verses 9 through 17. Eric, would you read that?
The plague of leprosy is in a man, then he shall be brought unto the priest. The priest shall see him, and behold, if the rising be white in the and not shut him up, for he is unclean. And if the leprosy break out abroad in the skin, and the leprosy cover all the skin of him that hath the plague from his head even to his foot, wheresoever the priest looketh, then the priest shall consider. And behold, if the leprosy hath covered all his flesh, he shall pronounce him clean that hath the plague. It is all turned white, he is clean. But when raw flesh appeareth in him, he shall be unclean.
Okay, so here we go into some more finite detail on this, right? Here again, just because it carries a certain condition does not necessarily mean it's leprosy. My case of psoriasis is very mild, but there are people that have extreme cases of it where it covers their arms and their chest and all like that. That's why a lot of times, even in the heat of summer, and it's due for skin protection, but there are people like that wear long sleeves year round because of that. Does that necessarily mean it's the hardcore case of leprosy? As we use the term? In their case, they've got a skin condition. The priest has deemed that's not leprosy, okay? And so they shall be pronounced clean. So, anyway, Morgan, I'm not a Jewish medical doctor, and I'm not going to attempt to be, okay? Anyway, that's kind of the general thought pattern of it. And as you look down through there, that's kind of what the picture that you're getting to see here, okay? These verses detail the procedure if the infection spreads or changes, including further examination and pronouncement of cleanliness or uncleanness, depending upon the conditions and symptoms. All right, infections now from boils and burns, okay? Verses 18 through 28. Daniel, do you have that? Yeah, 18 through 28. Let's see. Is that right? Where am I at? Yes. Okay.
If the body develops a boil on the skin and is healed, and in the place of the boil there comes a white swelling or a bright spot, reddish white, and it shall be shown to the priest. And if, when the priest sees it, it indeed appears deeper than the skin, and its hair has turned white, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous sore which has broken out of the boil. But if the priest examines it, and indeed there are no white hairs in it, and it is not deeper than the skin, but has faded, then the priest shall isolate him 7 days. And if it should at all spread over the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous sore. But if the bright spot stays in one place and has not spread, it is the scar of the boil, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. Or if the body receives a burn on its skin by fire, and the raw flesh of the burn becomes a bright spot, reddish white or white, and the priest shall examine it, and indeed if the hair of the bright spot has turned white, and it appears deeper than the skin, it is leprosy broken out of the burn. Therefore the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous sore. But if the priest examines it, and indeed there are no white hairs in the right spot, and it is not deeper than the skin, but has faded, then the priest shall isolate him 7 days. And the priest shall examine him on the 7th day. If it has at all spread over the skin, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is a leprous sore. But if the bright spot stays in one place and has not spread on the skin, but has faded, it is a swelling from the burn. The priest shall pronounce him clean, where it is the scar from the burn.
Okay, so can we see how this is playing out? You see these conditions and you see these symptoms, as I said, then this is how you react to that condition or that symptom. Well, after a period of time, you can either deem it leprosy, and probably pretty much if it was in somewhat of an advanced stage and you see it, you could probably pretty well be assured that it's leprosy, right? of some type, okay? But if you isolate that person for 7 days and nothing becomes of it, well, that person's pronounced clean, okay? So it's kind of back and forth with these conditions and symptoms. And I didn't try to get a chart and pull up and say, okay, what are these conditions and symptoms and all this is, and what does that mean, and who knows? Because see, you got to remember too, they had conditions like we did today, only worse. Remember, you did have things like ringworms and psoriasis and measles and chicken pox and just pick something, okay? And it was more prolific back then than it is today, because pretty much the free world, I'll just say it that way, has done a very good job of holding it at bay, in some cases almost eradicating it, okay? The danger of it comes in even today is from countries that don't have a control of it. And they bring it and reintroduce it into the population. That's where it gets dangerous. So that's kind of the idea from the boils and burns that you receive. Just because you have a condition associated with a boil, a burn, or an infection, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a type of skin disease or leprosy, as they call it. Okay? The process for diagnosing and addressing infections from boils and burns is outlined. This includes isolation, re-examination, and final pronouncement. Infections on the head or chin, verses 29 through 37. Reed, would you read that?
Now, if a man or woman has an infection on the head or on the beard, then the priest shall look at the infection. And if it appears to be deeper in the skin, there is thin yellowish hair in it, then the priest shall pronounce him unclean. With the scale, it is leprosy of the head or of the beard. But the priest looks at the infection of the scale, and indeed it appears to be no deeper than the skin, and there is no black hair in it. And the priest shall isolate the person with the scaly infection for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest shall look at the infection, and if the scale is not spread and no yellowish hair is growing, and the appearance of the scale is no deeper than the skin, then he shall shave himself, but he shall not shave the scale. And the priest shall isolate the person with the scale 7 more days. Then on the 7th day, the priest shall look at the scale, and if the scale is not spread in the skin, and it appears to be no deeper than the skin, the priest shall pronounce him clean, and he shall wash his clothes and be clean.
Okay, so here we go again. What about places that appear on the face and the chin and things of that nature? Well, here again, and I'm sounding like a broke record, just because you have an appearance of something doesn't necessarily mean it is. So here, if the priest sees something, he's to follow these steps to see if it is or is not. And if it's not, he's pronounced clean, or if he goes through this structured period of time and it gets worse, then he's pronounced unclean, isn't he? And notice something else that crops in, and I believe this is going to kind of be an overview of all this when you talk about clean and unclean. It brings into about washing the clothes, okay? Washing isn't going to be an important part of this irregardless, even though other places did not necessarily mention it. But he is going to get into here now shortly about the garments and the bandages you use to wrap with. What about that stuff, okay? What do you do about that? What if it's got infectious material in it? What's going on here with all this? So washing is going to become a very important part of this. Instructions are given on dealing with infections on the head or chin with emphasis on hair color and the spread of infection. Baldness, white spots, and skin infections, verses 38 through 44. Jeff, would you read that for us, please?
When a man or a woman has spots on the skin of the body, white spots, the priest shall look. And if the spots on the skin of the body are dull white, it is leukemia. That has broken out on the skin and is keep clean. If the man's hair falls out of his head and he is bald, he is clean. If a man's hair falls from his forehead, his baldness of his forehead is clean. And if it is on the bull head or the bull forehead, reddish white, diseased area, it is the leprous disease breaking out on the bull head and the bull forehead. Then the priest shall examine him. If the disease swelling is reddish white on his head or on his bull forehead, like an appearance of leprous disease in the skin of the body, he is a leprous man. He is unclean. The priest must pronounce him unclean, his disease on his head.
Okay, so here again, looking at different parts of the body, have you noticed that? God even took it to different parts of the body. You know, so far we've looked at the skin and things of that nature. We've looked at the face and the chin. Now we're looking at baldness and white sores and skin infections on the head. So here again, he's looking, and notice something else here too. It has not mentioned women yet up until this point. So were women afflicted with this plague also? Yeah, nobody was isolated from it, okay? So just because it hadn't mentioned it, that don't mean that they were isolated from it. They were not. This section explains the protocol for diagnosing and addressing baldness, white spots, and other skin infections. Just because you're going bald, does that mean you got leprosy? No. There's certain other conditions that's got to be met too, okay? Sometimes as you get older, what happens to your hair, Jill? It falls out, don't it? Kind of like your teeth a lot of times. You ain't got to worry about going, back it, Yeah, I got it too. Anyway, so this is what we're looking at. Here we have a pathogen, germ, that's another word for germ. What we're going to look at here, regulations for diseased individual, verses 45 through 46. Ryan, would you read that for us?
The leprous person who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose. He shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean, he shall live alone, his dwelling shall be outside the camp.
Okay, that's the first time that we see this too, that he shall live alone and he's going to be outside the camp. So these people were directly quarantined away from everybody else until these conditions were ascertained. So we find it could be a condition that you could be healed from, couldn't you? Maybe you got a bad case of the chicken pox. You still want to be isolated, don't you? Okay? I remember when I was a kid, because that's been last century sometimes, that they used to, anything, if you was even suspected of having measles, the mumps, or the chicken pox, or anything, guess what you were expected to do? Stay home, okay? They didn't want to give it to the rest of the school, okay? The regulations for how diseased individuals should present themselves and live within the community are detailed. Contamination of garments and wraps, verses 47 through 59. Okay? Morgan, would you begin with verse 47? I'll stop you about halfway, then Eric, I'll let you finish it out. I would like to get through with this chapter.
Also, if a garment has a leprous plague in it, whether it is woolen garment or linen garment, whether it is in the woof of linen or wool, whether in leather or in anything made of leather, and if the plague is greenish or reddish in the garment or in the leather, whether in the warp or in the woof or in anything made of leather, it is a leprous plague and shall be shown to the priest. The priest shall examine the plague and isolate that which has the plague 7 days, and he shall examine the plague on the 7th day. If the plague is spread in the garment, either in the warp or in the woof, in the leather or in anything made of leather, the plague is an active leprosy. It is unclean. He shall therefore burn that garment in which is plague, whether warp or woof, in wool or in linen or anything of leather, where it is active leprosy. The garment shall be burned in the fire.
Okay, so you can stop right there, and I'll have Eric picked up at 53. So what are we starting to see about the garments and the wraps and stuff like that? If you're suspicious of leprosy, you burn it, okay? And that's not unusual. That is traditionally what's happened until modern medicine. It has to be destroyed, okay? So That's the regulation dealing with this. The Lord provides guidance for dealing with contamination in various materials, outlining the process for cleaning, re-examination, and if necessary, destruction of the contaminated items. Even today, what do we do with items that's contaminated with blood and body fluid? Generally in the workplace, they are destroyed, okay? They're surrendered, okay? Now, when you go to the doctor now, a lot of times, things that are under their control, the needles, the syringes, the garments, the covers, the whatever, what do they do with them? They destroy them. Now, just so we're clear, can you wash those implements and those garments? Yes, but there's strict regulations on that. The water's got to be a certain temperature, they got to be in there a certain time, a certain chemical, and all like that. Now, Ryan, what I always found really interesting about all this, and all these different chemicals that's out there in the market, the Red Cross and the EPA, you know how they used to train us? You know what they used to call it? Just use some Clorox. Kills it all graveyard dead. Okay? So that's what we always used. Just plain old Clorox. You have to walk. But now we still had to get rid of the contaminated mop or the contaminated rags or whatever we used to clean it up. Okay? Same thing here. So you got to get rid of the contaminated product. Okay? And destruction thereof. Oh, I hadn't got to 59, have Ed, would you read, pick up at verse 53?
But if the priest examines it, and indeed the plague is not spread in the garment, either in the warp or in the wool, or in anything made of leather, then the priest shall command that they wash the thing in which is the plague, and he shall isolate it another 7 days. Then the priest will examine the plague after it has been washed, and indeed if the plague is not changed its color, though the plague is not spread, it is unclean, and you shall burn it in the fire. It continues eating away whether the damage is outside or inside. If the priest examines it, and indeed the plague is faded after washing it, then he shall tear it out of the garment, whether out of the warp or out of the wool or out of the leather. But if it appears again in the garment, either in the warp or in the wool or in anything made of leather, it is the spreading plague. You shall burn with fire that in which is the plague. And if you wash the garment, either warp or wool or whatever is made of leather, if the plague has disappeared from it, then it should be washed a second time, and it should be clean. This is the law of the leprous plague of the garment of wool or linen, either in the warp or in the wool or anything made of leather, to pronounce it clean or to pronounce it unclean.
Okay, so there again, conditions, symptoms, how to handle it, how to deal with it. Now, what to do with it, okay? Well, if it's contaminated, you burn it. One of the things, those of us that's dealt with the wash, rinse, repeat method of how you cleanse these things based on water temperature and chemicals used and things of that nature, did they not do the same thing? Just to be sure, wash your garments, okay? Rinse, Daniel, and what? Repeat, second time, right? Thoroughly cleanses what they give you. So, not unusual thoughts, is it? Okay? Still carried out today. Why all this detail about leprosy? This detailed chapter elucidates the Lord's directive to Moses and Aaron regarding the identification, treatment, and isolation of individuals afflicted with various skin conditions and fabric contamination. The purpose was to maintain the purity of the community and, by extension, their sanctity before the Lord. Leprosy, what we find, is like sin in many ways. So we can see an analogy, a shadow, or whatever of this. If a person is not cleansed of their disease, then what happens? They die. If they died in an unholy state, they burn with fire, don't they? Okay? What in the mind of God and His thought pattern has really changed? How so? There are some good reasons why many ancient rabbis considered a leper as someone already dead. Leprosy is like sin in that it begins as nothing. It is painless in its first stages. It grows steadily. It often remits for a while, then returns. right? The devil, he'll flee for a while and he'll come back more. Okay? Gotta hurry up. It numbs the senses. One cannot feel the afflicted area. Isn't that what sin does to us if we continue in it, that eventually you become hardened to sin, the right of sin? Okay? So sin is deceitful. You can become hardened to it. It causes decay and deformity. It eventually gives a person a repulsive appearance. What usually happens to people that stay stooped in sin, they begin to get looser and looser and looser and looser, don't they? And very often than not, it bleeds over into their appearance, doesn't it? Okay? Uncleanliness, unhappiness, dinginess, the whole thing. So, what does that lead to? And finally, a horrible death. Is that not what sin also leads to today? If you look at some of the conditions and the similarities of it today. So, are there lessons here? And I kind of like getting into types and shadows and all this, okay? And I know I hadn't done it in a couple of chapters. I'm trying to get this so I can cover a chapter a week, okay? So it looks like we can get more back into that if I keep it, Jeff, still condensed, okay? Because our time is up. What's wrong with your right? The end. I'm saying we'll get ready for the worship service here just a minute.